キヤノングローバル戦略研究所研究主幹杉山大志です。本日はですね、アメリカブレークスルー研究所からヴィジャヤ・ラマチャンドラさんをお迎えいたしましてお話を伺います。で、お話の内容ですけれども、今ですね、先進国はですね、温暖化対策のためとしてですね、開発途上国への化石燃料事業に関する援助を禁止するということをやっています。で、この結果ですね、何が起きているかというと、先進国はまだ化石燃料を使い続けているんだけれども、貧しい国々がですね、化石燃料を開発できないと、それを使うことができないという問題が生じております。で、今日はこれについてですね、詳しくお話を伺っていきます。で、お話を伺った後にQ&A ということで、いくつかやり取りをさせていただきます。それではラマチャンドラさん、よろしくお願いいたします。
So hello everyone, I'm Vijaya Ramachandran. I'm the Director for Energy and Development at the Breakthrough Institute in Berkeley, California. And I'm really delighted to be here today to speak to you all about the energy transition in low-income countries. So my presentation today is going to be about energy access for the poorest countries in the world. I am going to go through several slides now where I show you some data and some information on energy access in poor countries and what we can do to have better policy around this very important issue. First slide. Climate diplomacy has focused on the 1.5 degree target and the 2050 net zero targets. So to limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees and to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, rich countries like the European Union and the United States have been insisting that energy project financing in poor countries be restricted only to green energy projects. Green energy means things like wind and solar. The European Union and US insist that financing banks such as the World Bank and the European Investment Bank finance only wind and solar and green hydrogen and things like smart microgrid networks that work on renewable energy. They want to stop all financing of natural gas projects in Africa as soon as 2025, and until then, they want to finance them only in exceptional circumstances. The next slide. The view of Western diplomacy in developing countries, especially on fossil fuels. Developing countries know that no rich country runs on renewables only. Apart from Iceland, no one is even close. Rich countries' domestic policies are much different than what they are advocating for poor countries. So let's take an example. Norway is a good example. With natural gas prices at record highs in Europe, Norway is making a lot of money. In recent years, it agreed to increase natural gas exports by 2 billion cubic meters to alleviate Europe's acute energy shortage. Its neighbors, such as Britain, are grateful for more gas supplies as winter approaches. The next slide, more on Western hypocrisy. Europe and the United States know the value of their own oil and gas industry. And Norway is the most fossil fuel dependent rich country in the world. Crude oil and natural gas account for 41% of exports, 14% of gross domestic product, 14% of government revenues, and 6 to 7% of employment. Norway has the largest hydrocarbon reserves in Europe and is the world's third largest exporter of natural gas. It's effectively telling Africa, we'll stay rich, keep you from developing, and send some charity your way as long as you keep your emissions down. So while Norway and other European countries are exporting gas or buying gas, they do not want Africans to be extracting any gas from their substantial reserves. Next slide, green colonialism. The hypocrisy of Norway extends to other countries. I sometimes call this green colonialism. Germany, for example, has opened a new coal mine last year, producing lignite, which is the worst form of coal, the most polluting. Germany is also building 4 new LNG terminals to import more natural gas. LNG is liquid natural gas or liquefied natural gas. Germany has given itself 20 years to exit from coal, but these targets are not binding. The UK approved a new coal mine in 2021. President Biden has set lofty targets for curbing emissions, but has also called on OPEC to ramp up production to meet US demand for oil. US oil production is at a historic high. The US is producing more oil now than it ever has in its entire history. In the days after COP26, the US auctioned the rights to extract 1 billion barrels of oil in the Gulf of Mexico. Similar actions were taken in the days after the Paris Treaty was signed, and every COP after that, the US has auctioned off the rights to oil extraction in the aftermath of the COP or, a few months later. And as I mentioned earlier, it's producing the most oil it has ever produced at this moment in time. The next slide. Why does this matter? About 600 million people live without any electricity at all, almost all in Africa. These people live in abject poverty. Annual incomes are at $2,000 to $3,000 per capita, about 20 times less than the US or Europe or Japan. Schools, hospitals, and factories do not have electricity. Jobs are lost, lives are lost, infant mortality is very high in many African countries. And for all of this, energy is a factor. These countries cannot escape poverty without a significant increase in energy use. And some of that will have to come from fossil fuels. Modern high-yield agriculture, which Africa needs to feed its population and offer rural youth a better future than subsistence farming, is heavily reliant on energy. So here's a chart this is the next slide, a chart from the Energy for Growth Hub. Here's a chart that shows the electricity per capita in some poor countries, not all in Africa, but some in other parts of the world as well, compared to the energy consumption of an American refrigerator. So here you can see that in Haiti, for example, electricity per capita is 37 kilowatt hours per year. In Tanzania, it's 121. In Nigeria, it's 133. In Kenya, it's 157. But look at a fridge in the US. Just a fridge alone consumes 459 kilowatt hours a year. Energy consumption in African countries is a small, tiny fraction of what Americans consume or what Europeans consume or what Japanese consume. In the case of the US, average per capita consumption of electricity is 13,000 kilowatt hours per year. So basically 100 times what an African consumes in, say, Nigeria. Next slide. This is my work with Arthur Baker, based on work that Ian Mitchell and Arthur Baker had done earlier. Here we look at the projection of emissions in gigatons, divided up by groups of countries. And rather than use traditional groupings, we grouped it so that we've isolated out the high emitters. So we have low-income countries, which is that really, really thin line in light green at the very top. And then we have the lower middle-income countries. And then we've calculated for India separately, because India is a large country with some emissions, significant emissions. Then you have the upper middle income countries, then you have China, you have Russia, and you have high income countries. So you can see that, for the combination of low income countries and lower middle income countries, excluding India, the amount of emissions is really small. And it's going to be small all the way till 2035. These are not countries that are going to become major emitters anytime soon. Certainly not as compared to the high-income countries or as compared even to the middle-income countries. In fact, the poorest 64 countries in the world the poorest 64 countries in the world emit about 5% of global emissions. Sub-Saharan Africa as a whole emits about 4% of emissions, and cumulatively, since we started measuring emissions, accounts for about somewhere between 0.5% and 1% of global emissions. So really, really small emitters. So we're telling the lowest emitting countries that they cannot have any fossil fuels. Meanwhile, the rich countries, very large emitters, are adding all the fossil fuels they want: oil, coal, gas, buying it, extracting it, producing it, doing whatever they like in the name of energy security. Just to reiterate in the next slide, energy is necessary for agriculture, it's necessary for transportation, it's necessary for lots of different things. Yields right now are 1/10 of those in the rich world, and Africa is heavily dependent on costly imports, including of fertilizer, but also of food itself. Synthetic fertilizer to improve yields is most efficiently produced with natural gas. Africa also needs cement and steel to build homes and factories that are critical to large-scale industrialization and the generation of thousands of jobs. Roads and building construction are energy-intensive and fossil-intensive, as is cold storage for food and medicines. And the transport sector remains almost entirely dependent on oil and gas, despite the advent of electric vehicles and so on. We still have a very long way to go in terms of decarbonizing the transport sector. So oil and gas still playing a really, really important role globally in Africa, but also elsewhere. We are not anywhere near independent from fossil fuels. So telling Africans they can only have renewables while nobody else has weaned off of fossil fuels is sort of deeply unfair. Poor countries need a lot of energy to adapt to climate change. Climate change is often the reason given for why we are banning the financing of fossil fuels in Africa. But the fact is, to adapt to climate change, which is what most African countries will have to do, it's a problem they did not create, but it's a problem that they are feeling the effects of. In order to adapt to climate change, they're going to need a lot more energy. Early warning systems, irrigation, desalination, air conditioning, resilient buildings, all of these things need a lot of energy in order to function. If you want an early warning system or you want a hospital to function in the event of a weather shock or a climate shock, it's going to have to need a continuous supply of electricity. Perhaps most importantly, fossil fuel electricity generation is still needed to balance out weather-dependent wind and solar. No amount of solar energy or wind power, even if they could be built out quickly enough, could fuel development in the global south without backup power using fossil fuels. And of that, gas is the cleanest by far. It's also the easiest to ramp up as a backup fuel. Finally, poor countries need a lot of energy for homes, schools, factories, industrial heat for producing cement and steel, carbon dioxide, that is essential component of synthetic fertilizer, and liquefied gas, which is needed for transportation and for cooking fuel. And I want to point out that LPG fuel is far cleaner, far safer than biomass cooking, which has significant health effects, particularly for women and children. A ban on financing gas projects by the United States and the European Union with no low-cost alternatives available would practically end support for the critical energy infrastructure needed to support economic development and raise living standards. I think this is unethical and immoral, and it's not something that poor countries are tolerating. They are deeply unhappy with this policy, and rightfully so, because they do have a right to lift themselves out of poverty. With that, I will end my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vijaya. It was very clear and interesting presentation. And let me ask you several questions now. And the first question is that you said that you are from Berkeley, America, but you look like Indian and your name look like Indian. So could you tell us a little bit about your origin?
Certainly, Taishi. Yes, I live in the U.S. now, and our offices are in Berkeley, California. I am a naturalized U.S. citizen. I became a citizen in 2000, but I was born and raised in India. I'm from Bangalore, which is now sort of the Silicon Valley of India. It's where all the high-tech companies are. But when I was growing up in India, Bangalore was a small town, and we had chronic electricity shortages, and it's not something that I've forgotten. It was, deeply inconvenient. It was difficult. It made life very difficult. And I think, despite the fact that I've now lived in the U.S. For 4 decades, I haven't forgotten what it's like to live in a city or in a place where electricity is not easily available. In the US, we take it for granted, but in India, we still don't take it for granted.
I see. And then let me go into a couple of questions. I think that you've given your talk already at the various arena, and I'm wondering what might be the reaction from the economic development community in the global South countries.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have gotten a tremendous amount of support from the global South community and particularly from researchers and policymakers in Africa, because they almost universally believe that they have the right to develop a variety of energy sources in order to lift themselves out of poverty. They are quick to point out that many African countries are majority renewable. Many of them have chosen paths that are renewable intensive, unlike the rich countries which used almost entirely fossil fuels for their development. They are quick to point out that they have made the choice to develop solar and wind and geothermal and hydro, but that they also have the right to develop their very, very large natural gas reserves. And it is deeply unfair for a very rich global north to tell them that they cannot do what they need to do to lift themselves out of poverty. So in the global south, I've had a tremendous amount of support, a tremendous amount of agreement with these views. Also, many Africans have written very eloquently about this subject, including several African heads of state who have made the case that Africa needs to develop its gas reserves, it needs to develop a variety of energy sources. In the global south, a lot of interest, a lot of sympathy for this view. Also in India, where I've published in the Indian newspapers, a lot of sympathy for the view that developing countries need all the flexibility that they have to lift themselves out of poverty. That poverty remains a very deeply aggravating problem for much of sub-Saharan Africa and parts of India as well.
All right, and I think you also given talk to the global north countries or developed countries. How do they react?
So here the reaction is interesting, right? When you think about the global north, there's sort of two sets of reactions I get. One is outright disagreement. So the people who disagree sort of offer up Malthusian arguments in the sense that what would happen when all these Africans become rich and they're still emitting a whole lot of carbon? That's going to sort of ruin our plans to fight climate change, and it's going to make it much harder to fight climate change. The arguments are always about climate change. But the arguments are also, I think, very Malthusian. There isn't much recognition that Africans are using a lot of renewable energy, that battery storage costs may come down, that newer technologies may arrive that are cleaner, such as advanced nuclear, for example, that may result in emissions going down even as Africa develops its massive energy reserves. So I feel like those arguments are very doomsday arguments. They're very unfair, given that we will need natural gas as a bridge fuel or a transition fuel until such time as battery costs come down or as other technologies emerge. But there's little recognition of that. There's sort of this fear that, all of these Africans are going to be emitting all this carbon. I kind of think of it as Malthus 2.0, because, the Malthusian argument originally was that there would be too many Indians or too many Africans and we wouldn't have enough food now to feed everyone. Now the argument is that we're afraid of too many people and their carbon emissions. So it's sort of Malthus 2.0. So I get that reaction a lot, that they're sort of afraid of what happens when Africa grows to 2 billion people. So that's one reaction I get from the global north. The other reaction I get is tacit agreement that, this is deeply unfair. That while the US is expanding oil production and while the Europeans are buying all the natural gas they can possibly buy from Norway and Qatar and so on, it is deeply unfair to Africans to be telling them that they can't have what the West has. That second argument that agrees with me is often made sort of off the record, quietly in meetings, but very rarely publicly. I think publicly, the Western countries have become so completely consumed with prioritizing the fight against climate change over everything else that they feel compelled to say that they're not going to finance fossil fuels in Africa. Ironically, that's not going to help at all to fight climate change. What we really need is deep cuts in emissions in the global north. But I think it's just politically much easier to talk about the developing world.
Then, is there any sign of policy change of the blanket ban on fossil fuel in the global north? I mean, that by the global north imposed on global south.
Yeah. So I might be optimistic about this, but I feel like there has been some change. I feel like there's more room now to talk about it, certainly, and maybe also to finance it. So, for example, the World Bank is financing a gas field in Mozambique and has been talking about it publicly in recent months. So that's a very good sign, I think. I know that other global north countries have also invested in the Mozambique fields. So this is a good sign. I think there's more flexibility to talk about it. I think there is better understanding of how difficult it's going to be for Africans if this ban is imposed. I don't see any big changes to the official policies, but I do see some room. I see some flexibility, some signs of recognition of the arguments I'm making.
Okay. You have been mostly focused on natural gas and least developing economies, but I think that your story also applies to coal. I mean that in Asian context, coal is much easier to access for many countries, and there are not least developed countries, but there are many countries that still need electricity. And I think, do you think that your story also applied to all those countries and coal as well?
Yeah, the coal story is a complex one, I think, and you're absolutely right that there are several countries, particularly in Asia, that are heavily dependent on coal, no more so than India. So India gets 70% of its electricity from coal. India will continue to use coal, I think, for some decades. There are plans to decarbonize and to reduce dependence on coal, but coal plays a very central role in India's economic development, and not just for electricity. We think about coal as primarily a fuel, as it is primarily a fuel, and it powers the economy and it powers a number of critical sectors, cement, steel, so on, heavy industry and so on in India. But there is another aspect to India's coal production, which is that coal revenues are collected by Coal India and then divided up to several hundred districts across the country and used to fund education, to fund healthcare, to fund infrastructure, to fund all sorts of basic services in cities and in rural areas. So coal is a very, very important part of India's economic development and not just from an energy perspective. So simply showing up at COP and insisting that India ends its coal production is deeply unrealistic. If India is going to decarbonize, and it does want to, it's making huge investments in solar, for example, and some wind as well. But if India wants to decarbonize, it's going to be a long, complicated process, which is going to involve a lot of money transferred from rich countries to India as part of a just energy transition program. And that doesn't mean making India more indebted. It means really financing the transition out of coal, which most rich countries have been reluctant to do. They're very happy to tell India that it shouldn't produce any coal, but they're much less happy to fund the ways by which India could exit coal. I mean, one of the things rich countries could do is, for example, really bring down the cost of battery storage or the cost of batteries, and then transfer that technology without cost to poor countries and to lower middle income countries. Those sorts of things would be real steps towards helping India to wean off of coal, or Indonesia or other countries. But we haven't seen a lot of that. What we've seen is, kind of lots of declarations, particularly around COP, to sort of try to force India to exit coal, but it's not going to be able to do that. It's a very complicated process of exit, and a lot of regions are depending on those revenues as well. So I think we are looking at a period of time whereby coal will still be a very major source of energy in Asia. It will power the economies of Asia for a while. It doesn't have the financing ban problem that gas has in Africa, because countries like India, Indonesia, and so on can raise capital on private markets. So they're not subject to fossil fuel financing bans from the World Bank and things like that. But I do think that the global north can do a lot more concretely and provide more resources for decarbonization away from coal if they truly care about this problem. And also they need to understand that it will take a long time. It's a complex problem.
Final question is that you've already talked about this already a bit, but let me elaborate. I'm wondering who is financing the fossil fuel projects in least developed nations, in for example, in Africa. You say that India and Indonesia can raise funds out of their own economy, but I don't think it's applicable to many countries. Who is financing for that, or no one?
Yeah, very good question, Taishi. So, because the Western countries will not finance either multilaterally or bilaterally, African countries are increasingly looking to China, which takes a much more pragmatic role, understands how important energy is, understands that Africans need to lift themselves out of poverty. And so China has been providing financing for energy projects, for infrastructure projects, for rail and road projects that are all energy intensive. China does not impose these types of limitations. And African countries are looking to China. We just saw the conclusion of the big China-Africa summit in Beijing, where President Xi pledged an enormous amount of money towards Africa's development. So I think we'll see Chinese money as a source of lending for some time to come. Also, Russia is a major funder. Russia is interested in financing nuclear energy in Africa, and also in licensing its own nuclear technology to African countries. So Russia is a major funder. Russia has geopolitical interests in the region, strategic interests in the region, and will fund energy projects as needed to achieve those goals. And one of the things I like to emphasize to the West is that something you want to see happen from a geopolitical perspective or a strategic perspective? No. Do you want to yield this ground to China and Russia? Because you sort of claim you're fighting climate change, which these bans will not do. The amounts that African countries are emitting are so low and will remain low for so long that fossil fuel financing bans are not going to reduce emissions in any significant way. At the same time, they're creating room for China and Russia to enter So that's something I think for the global north to think about seriously. The other set of investors in gas projects in Africa more broadly are private investors. So, for example, the GTA field off the coast of Mauritania, the BP is the anchor investor, and other private companies have come in. So there's quite a lot of private investment, in gas projects. Of course, that gas is mostly for export. So those companies are there exploiting these gas reserves so that they can ship the gas to Europe. What we want to see is more of that gas be made available for domestic use.
Right.
And for that, we do need the World Bank to play a role. We do need financing agencies to play a role. And I think the approach they currently have is quite short-sighted.
Thank you, Vijaya, for sharing your knowledge and your analysis. It's much appreciated. I think it means a lot to Japan as well, and we have to rethink our foreign policy on the fossil fuel development. Thank you indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much, Taishi.